John, one of the first questions I usually ask is, where's your hometown? Where are you from?
South coast of England, from Southampton.
In England?
Yeah,
When did you come to the States? Young boy or?
during the war, actually. I was in the intelligence corps of the British Army, and we were stationed all over the place. So I spent some time in Egypt, and then a year in India, and then they're making up an international unit in the United States, and I was transferred to Camp Ritchie, Maryland. And then when the war ended, we were an advance group, went to Japan, and then we came back to Washington, D.C., which is where I met my wife, and then back to England, and I still had about 6 months of Army service to do then at that time, before I got out. And my wife and I were married shortly before I left for England, and then we came back to this side, intending to live in Canada, but that didn't work out, so we came back into the States, and that's where we've been since then.
Oh, you've been all over the place.
Yeah.
Let's start in England. You grew up there.
Yeah.
And how old were you? Were you drafted by the British Army or?
No, I volunteered for training as a Japanese translator. And so I spent a year at the University of London, but we were doing officers training at the same time. It was at the university. And after a year, they asked for volunteers to go to India. So I put my hand up, which turned out to be a good move.
Let me ask you another question before we get to India. Did you know any Japanese language at all? Or you started from scratch?
No, I learned at University of London. We had a year there. Yeah.
Well, then your intention was to be an interpreter at some point.
Translator.
Translator, I should say.
Yeah.
Okay. Now we know what you were doing. Now you left England and went to India.
Yeah. That, as I say, that turned out to be a good move to volunteer early, because when we got there, we found that the unit was entirely for officers. So I went from private to first lieutenant in one jump in New Delhi, and then was promoted to captain later on when I came to the States.
Now the British Army.
Yes.
Had you go from private to lieutenant at the flick of a switch?
Yeah, just like that.
Just like that. Well, that's nice.
Yeah, headquarters was in the old Red Fort in Delhi, and I went in there as a private and came out with 2 pips with a first lieutenant.
Now, did you sign up to go to India, or did they send you there, and why?
They were looking for people to work in intelligence in India, and so I volunteered to go there.
Now, you work in the intelligence. What arena were you in intelligence? Code breaking, traffic, what, radio?
No, we were getting documents coming from the front line in Burma at that time. And what we were doing was doing a quick analysis of them, which we sent up to higher level, and they decided whether they wanted a full translation or not. So mostly we were dealing with things coming immediately from the front line, doing a quick check, a quick translation, sending that up to headquarters, and they came back with, if they wanted more, then they came back to us to do.
Now that's Japanese to English translation.
Yes.
You were able to pick up enough in 1 year of school to be the translator.
Well, that was all we did, was with that and officers training, was all we did that year.
Okay. What kind of information did you want or receive or pass on when you were in India?
Well, we didn't always know. We didn't know what the top level people were looking for. So we just gave them a brief of what we had, and they would come back with more information. One of the things that very little was known about was the topography of the whole Southeast Asia area. They were looking for information on the topography, looking for roads and access points and that sort of thing.
I don't have a visual on a map. How close is Burma to India? Right next door?
Right next door.
Okay.
Yeah, the Japanese actually came into northeastern India, into Assam.
How'd they get them out?
They're just straight up through Burma to the north, and you're into northeastern India there.
So then the India Army pushed the Japanese back?
Well, a combination of the British Army, the Indian Army, There were a lot of British Empire forces in there too. So that it was a combination of forces that did it. At the time that I got to India, the thing was just turning, or beginning to push the Japanese out of Assam back down the Indonesian peninsula.
Now, how much time did you spend in India?
A year. I was there a year.
A full year?
Yeah. And I was replaced by an American.
Okay, now when you did the translation to English,
Yes.
that means you had to talk to a number of captured Japanese soldiers?
No, I never did that. So they were said our unit was going down into Burma, one man at a time as needed, but it never came around to me. I was shipped off to the United States before I was.
Now, one man went into Burma to see what's going on and bring the information back?
Yeah, he would work in the front line and interview captives and send information back. Yeah.
How did you do any translation if you didn't see any Japanese soldiers?
All the documents that were picked up.
You could read it.
Yeah.
Read it well. Okay.
Oh yes. Yeah, a lot of documents were taken off prisoners and off bodies, and from captured headquarters, we get mail sacks full of stuff would come back.
Mail sacks of Japanese letters going back and
Yeah.
forth. Private letters, I assume, and then military
Yes.
letters. Was the Japanese language on paper a difficult thing to learn?
It's not easy. It's very different from any other from Western languages. You've got to come at it entirely differently. It's not an easy language. It's a very complicated language, actually. It's the Japanese have a fetish about politeness and your level in society, and the language changes depending on who you're talking to, who's talking to you. It's a very difficult. No Westerner ever speaks Japanese perfectly. You just don't catch on to the way it's done.
Different dialects depending on where you are?
Not different dialects, but different structures of the language depending on the relationship between you and the person that you're talking to. You've got to use the right spin on the language depending on who you're talking to.
Never knew that.
Yeah.
All right. Now, you spent time in India interpreting the written language to see what's going on. Did you ever come across anything that was rather exciting or dynamic when you were reading these papers?
We had an interesting puzzle one time. We had a map which we couldn't figure out quite where it was. The names didn't seem to make any sense. And it finally dawned on us what had happened. Because you can transliterate Burmese into Japanese phonetic script. And what had happened was that somebody who was a traditional Japanese had taken the names from Burmese into Japanese and written it Japanese style, normally from right to left. Somebody had copied the map, but not knowing any Burmese, had read it the other way around from left to right. So all the names were upside down. Finally figured out that somebody who didn't know Burmese had copied it and got it all wrong.
Well, I guess somebody finally figured it out.
Yeah.
Did the map turn out to be of any importance?
Not very much. No. The main thing that the hot people were looking for was possible future movements. Where were units and where were they moving? That was the main thing.
Now, while doing this, you're part of the British Army.
Yes.
And British Army uniform, correct?
Yes.
All right. Now, how did you end up going back to the States? Something you requested, or they sent you to the States?
Well, there was a unit being established in the United States on the same pattern as the one that we were in India, who was taking documents and doing long-range translation and appreciation of the documents, which was being established in Camp Ritchie in Maryland. And that was an international inter-service unit. That unit ended up being United States, British, Canadian, Australian, Army, Navy, Air Force. We were all mixed into one unit.
All in one facility in Maryland?
Yep.
And the function of the unit is what?
Was taking documents from the Pacific and doing the same thing that we'd done with the Indian ones.
Okay. I never knew that was taking place, but I guess
Yeah, it was an interesting unit. There were people who were specialists in aircraft and aviation. There were Navy people, people who were experts in supply and munitions. The unit I was with was dealing with actually movement of army units within China, and so it was an interesting unit to be with.
Did anything of major importance get discovered with any of these divisions?
You never really knew. You were doing what somebody up above was saying, that we want information on this. You never really knew exactly what happened to what you were dealing with.
Well, it's a need-to-know thing. You know, the less people know about it, the better.
Yes.
Now you're now still in British uniform.
Yes.
While you're in Maryland. And how long were you in Maryland? You said a year?
Pardon?
How long were you in Maryland?
We were there, let's see, about 8 or 9 months actually. And then when the war ended in Japan, I went with an advanced echelon to Tokyo.
You went back up. You went with what?
Pardon?
You went with what to Tokyo?
An advanced unit.
Advanced unit,
Yeah,
okay.
Went into Tokyo. And our job there was to search all over the Japanese islands for caches of documents and information. And there was, I was in charge of the units which traveled north. And there was a Canadian officer who was handling units going to the south. And so most of them consisted of Japanese Americans who could speak Japanese very fluently, and they could search out areas where there were documents.
Well, now, did the Japanese Americans go with you on these searches?
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Was there, being that the war had just ended, wasn't there any concern about sniper activity, or somebody didn't want to?
At first we were concerned about it, but very soon we found that there was no problem. The Japanese are very interesting in that way, that they adapt very quickly to a different situation. And for the Japanese, war was over. You know, why make a mess of it? And they were very welcoming, very helpful, and we had no problems at all.
That's good to hear.
Yeah. Well, actually, the thing is, actually, we had more trouble on the way out to Japan because we landed in Guam to refuel, and the Japanese snipers were still in the hills there.
Yes.
And they didn't know that the war was over, or they didn't want to bother about it.
Well, there's a story about one man held out for a couple of years.
Yes.
Didn't know.
Yeah.
Now, when you were in Japan, where did they have you staying? What kind of building?
We were in the old Nippon Yusen Kaisha building, the Japanese steamship line there. They of course have ceased functioning because of the war, and the building was pretty much empty. And so we took over most of that building there, right across from the Imperial Palace in Tokyo.
You know, well, that's pretty impressive. Did you ever have a chance to go into the Imperial House?
Pardon?
Were you allowed to go into the Imperial House?
No, you couldn't get into the Imperial Palace, no. We were restricted in some ways. We couldn't go to Japanese restaurants or movies.
You couldn't go to the restaurants. Why?
Lack of food.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, you had to remember the Japanese were living on next to nothing.
Yeah.
And so you couldn't disturb their food distribution, which was reasonable enough, you know. In fact, we sort of broke that taboo. On one occasion, a group of us went down to a naval depot south of Tokyo. We had K rations with us, and on the way back, we stopped at a Japanese inn, and we swapped our K rations for their food and had a meal there before we came on back to Tokyo, which was strictly out of order.
I can see why. But let me go back to the Imperial building. Who was it that said you're not allowed in there? Your commanders?
So far as I know, nobody went in there. I think MacArthur and his staff may have done, but they would be the only ones who had gone in there. That was pretty strictly off limits. You stayed away from that. And I think that was a very good move on the part of MacArthur, was to keep the Japanese emperor in place.
Yeah.
And everything ran very, very smoothly. It was amazingly smoothly.
Now, how much time did you spend in Japan?
It would have been about 6 or 8 months. Then we came back to Washington, D.C., and all the documents we had collected had come back into Washington, and then we were given the job of sorting them and making an order out of them, which is where I got the idea of becoming a librarian, because you had to learn quickly how to organize a library out of what we had. And that's how I got into librarianship later on. But and that's where I met my wife, because on the floor above us in the building where we were in Washington, D.C., was the Navy's, U.S. Navy's Pacific Topographical Unit that did all the mapping. And that's where my wife was working. And I got to know her there.
You know, I read someplace there weren't any good topographical maps or maps at all, and they had to use maps made up by the National Geographic Society.
And they got an awful lot of picture postcards from people of the islands. In fact, there's an interesting story about that. One island that was being targeted for invasion, they didn't know much about. So they sent a submarine in. The submarine cruised around just with a periscope looking at the island. And they could figure out how many Japanese were on the island by counting the number of latrines along the beach.
That's a novel way to do a count. But once the war was over, then there was no invasion on the island. Then I guess. Did anybody go into that small island after?
Oh yeah, all the islands finally were occupied across the Pacific.
But did you have to go to some smaller islands?
No, we didn't.
You were on the mainland.
We came back to Washington, D.C. But then, of course, things were getting very much reorganized in the American units. And our unit was transferred then onto the command of the CIA. And the CIA...
But back up, what about the CIA?
We were transferred onto the command of CIA.
Wasn't that still called the OSS?
Yeah, that's right.
And later it got
OSS
changed.
that became a CIA.
Yes.
Yeah. And of course, they didn't employ any non-Americans, and so we had our orders not to wear uniform to work. But we were very quickly separated and sent back to England at that point.
Now, where were you when you were working with CIA? In Japan?
In Washington, D.C.
Oh, Washington, D.C. OSS.
Yeah,
I think Truman changed the name of it in 1948 or something.
something like that. Yeah.
No.
When I found I was being sent back to England, my wife and I decided we got to do things in a hurry, so we got married right before I was sent back, and she went back to England with me.
Now, you didn't have any choice. When you left Japan to go back to Washington, D.C., that wasn't your choice. That was assignment.
That was
choice.
assignment, yeah.
Okay.
And then the British were demobilizing people very slowly, because it was very hard for Britain to absorb many fellows out of the army. There was so much housing had been destroyed, and the jobs were all changing, so they were letting people out of the service slowly. And so I spent about another 6 months in London, twiddling my thumbs actually, because we were handling translations of Japanese documents that were being done, and I was sharing an office with a British civil servant. He was handling the non-classified material. I was handling the classified material. We were sitting at desks in the same room. I didn't know what the heck I was doing. It was all new to me. I had to get help from him. He wasn't supposed to look at the documents that I had. It was one of those silly situations.
Did you ever come across any document that was very unusual or exciting or a plan?
Well, we got into an interesting situation one time in Tokyo. 1st Cavalry Division was the unit occupying Tokyo at that time. And they called us and said that they'd found a cache of documents in somebody's backyard in the outskirts of Tokyo. So we went out with a truck and picked up all these boxes of documents, brought them back in. They turned out to be the originals of the Japanese Parliament bills.
Parliament what?
The Parliament bills from Japanese Parliament. They were originals. We got a call from MacArthur's headquarters next day. Put those back. We knew what was in them. There was no point in messing with documents that were important to the Japanese. Put them back where you got them from.
So what was in the documents?
All the parliamentary dealings of the Japanese Parliament.
Parliament, okay, but that's old.
We already knew what was in those.
Yeah, and that's old news.
Yeah.
Well, whatever. Now you're back in England, and you didn't have to. Well, before this, did you hit any other islands like Saipan, Iwo Jima?
No,
No
I
reason
didn't
to.
get hit those. No, I was strictly headquarters kind of person.
Now you're in England. You just get married, and then what happens next? Then you come to the U.S., or you stayed in England for a while.
I still had about 6 months to serve in the army
Okay.
before I got out, and then when I got out, my wife and I immediately started to look for shipping back to the United States, which what we had planned was to live in Canada. It was our intention, and so as soon as we could get a ship back, we came back to the United States, went to visit her family in Ohio, and then we took off for Canada and Vancouver. But all the Canadian ex-servicemen were doing the same thing. They were all going west, and finding a job in Vancouver was pretty darn difficult. And so we finally gave up on it and came back into the States and settled in here.
Now your wife was you said a wave, a Navy wave.
Yeah.
That's a U.S. deployment then.
Yeah.
Was she on a ship somewhere or just working on the offices?
No, she was just in Washington D.C. That was where was her assignment the whole time she was in there.
How long was she in? She was in the Army, I assume.
Navy.
Oh, yeah, I just said wave.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She was in what, a couple of years?
7 years.
2 years, I think she was
Okay.
in. Yeah.
Now you came back to the States. Where did you end up at? You came out of Canada and you flew to where, or drove to where?
Well, we went first of all to Ohio and stayed with my wife's parents.
Oh, okay.
And then went back to Washington D.C., where we had contacts, where we've been and had contacts. And what I intended to do then was to get back to university and get qualified as a librarian, which it turned out to be not that easy because they wouldn't accept any of my University of London credits at a university here, so I had to start from scratch as a freshman.
Oh, yeah.
But I did that and then went on to graduate school and got my library science master's degree and started to work on that in here.
Did you ever think of while you were in joining the OSS, CIA? You ever think about going with those boys?
No, I didn't. Some of the people that I worked with did. I know they ended up in that sort of thing. But I had just decided that librarianship was where I wanted to go, and that's what I concentrated on.
Well, can you relate to me any unusual stories that are exciting for somebody who's never been a part of that? Did anything ever happen to you?
Well, the interesting thing about my Army service is actually I was safer in the Army than I was before, because my hometown got pretty badly battered during the bombings of 1940, 1941. And the only really difficult time I had in the Army was on the way out to India. We were going through the Mediterranean and we got attacked a couple of times by aircraft. Got hit in the second one. Bomb went through the bows, came out through the side of the ship before it exploded. It exploded actually outside where the hole where it came through.
Anyway, this is a building or a vehicle?
A ship.
Oh, the ship.
Yeah.
And where did the projectile come from?
Italy. They were flying out of Italy at that time because the war was going on in Europe. And the planes were coming out of Italy and they attacked us a couple of times. We got a bomb through the bows the second time. And so we put into Egypt where they were going to patch up the ship, but it took them 6 weeks to decide what to do with this, so we finally went down to the south end of the Suez Canal, and we were picked up by a Polish freighter, and we went from there to Bombay on a Polish ship.
And what happened in Bombay? That
And
was,
that's where we worked for, well, we went from Bombay finally to Delhi and worked there for a year.
okay, so you got there by ship. There was no aircraft involved to drop you off?
Not that early, there weren't, no.
Okay.
And the British didn't have the aircraft to use anyway. The United States did. The United States had a lot of cargo craft, but the British didn't. So we were going by sea.
Well, didn't the British have their hands full in Burma?
Initially, yes, it was a bad situation.
What was that? It was a famous unit in Burma. A very famous British unit. Morales Marauder or something like that?
Yes, yeah, Merrill's
that what it
Marauders. Yeah,
I can't believe I remember that.
yeah,
Gee,
yeah, they were a very famous unit.
Did you ever meet anybody from that unit?
No, never did. They worked behind Japanese lines and caused a lot of havoc.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's-
And things began to move much more swiftly when American units started to come in, because there were more manpower, and so they were able to push the Japanese back a lot quicker.
Where were you when the atomic bombs were dropped? Where were you stationed at?
I was in the United States then.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you were in the statesides when you found out the war was over.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, when you went to Japan, is that something you wanted to do, or you just were assigned to do that?
I was assigned to do it. Yeah.
Okay.
My move to India, I volunteered for, but after that I was assigned, and there was a group of us who were assigned to go to Japan.
Did you ever try, or maybe you weren't allowed to make friends with some Japanese families?
I did a little. One of the people working with us was an Australian who'd been a missionary in Japan and spoke very fluent Japanese. And I went with him a couple of times to families, which, strictly speaking, we weren't supposed to do, but he had enough contacts already with local people.
How did he get out of there if he was Australian? When the war was he there when the war was going on?
No, he left there before the war began and went back
Okay.
to Australia. And then
He saw it.
yeah,
coming.
we had
But you had this family you went to visit.
there were people that he'd known when he was there as a missionary. He
Okay.
knew the Japanese there.
Did you have dinner there or just visit?
It was interesting. He and I went to a Japanese church for Christmas service that year.
Japanese
And it
church.
was interesting to hear a church
mean,
service in Japanese.
There was Christianity there?
Yeah, there are a lot of Christians in Japan. In
Yeah.
fact, Japanese are rather interesting in that way. They take religion very, very lightly. Japanese will be he'll be taken to a Buddhist temple when he's born. He'll get married in a Confucian or maybe a local Japanese temple, and he may very well go to a Christian church. It doesn't seem to make much difference to Japanese. It's they'll take one or the other as it suits them.
Did you ever get near the Hiroshima?
No,
and
no,
the-
I wasn't assigned to that part of Japan at all. I was working in the northern part of Japan.
So you weren't right in Tokyo all the time. You were north of Tokyo.
I was in Tokyo most of the time. I
Okay.
did make a couple of trips out of there. But it's very interesting now. Two of us went to pick up some documents south of Tokyo one time, and we stopped off on the way back in Kamakura, where there's a very famous, big, enormous statue of the Buddha. There's nobody there. The whole coastline had been emptied by the Japanese. There was no one in the town at all. It was just eerie.
Do you know why that was?
Yeah.
The Japanese emptied the
Well,
town?
they were afraid of invasion, from the shore, and so they moved all the civil population away from the shore, so that it would be clear for any fighting that went on.
That must mean it was a good beach to launch
Yeah,
soldiers in.
yeah. It's a beautiful town. Now it's a busy center. Now, but it was a beautiful town, but empty, absolutely empty.
Well, then at the end of the war, did the people go back?
Gradually, they went back.
And that happened when you were there?
Yeah. Many Japanese didn't know quite what to do at the end of the war, because we had some storage space in one of the munitions factories just on the edge of Tokyo. machinery was still running when we went there. You know, nobody told them to stop, so they just went on. And,
Were there people in there working?
well, there were, a few were still there, but then gradually they got back into their local homes. But no, the Japanese were sort of didn't know quite what to do with the end of the war. Just to
I
finish.
can understand that.
Yeah,
I don't know if I don't know what to do.
yeah.
So, did you ever have any Japanese soldier make things difficult for you?
No, never.
Could they look you in the eye, or they always look down?
The Japanese are pretty straightforward.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, what they have gone through, and now there's an occupying force. I just assumed it would be difficult to look your opponent in the eye under those circumstances. Now.
Yeah, but the Japanese can adapt to a situation very quickly, and if they lost the war, so they adapt. You know. The only people we really had were sticky were the Russians. There was a small group of Russian soldiers in Tokyo, and they were sticky people, much more than the Japanese.
Now, I don't know the definition of sticky except for a postage stamp.
They weren't very friendly.
Okay, that's a nice way to put it. They wouldn't make a good neighbor.
No. And the Daiichi Hotel, that was reserved for majors and above. Yeah. But even the Russian privates were in there. They were going to take everything they could get.
Okay. Well, this has really been interesting for me to listen to this. Is there any area I should be going with this that I've missed to ask you about? Any exceptional, exciting moment that had you sweat?
I don't know. What I carried away from the war, I think, was the fact that people can get along so well together. I served in such mixed units, and you would sort of anticipate that there'd be some problems, but there never were. There was always some little difficulty between British troops and Australian troops, because Australians were all volunteers. They were paid very highly, and they had much more prestige than the British. But I never encountered that at all. And I think it was a very interesting experience to me, how you can bring people from different backgrounds, different societies, different levels, and they can work things out. They can get along together very well, and we did.
Well, when you have a common enemy, everybody's focused on the goal.
That helps, yes.
If there's all separate different, well, and I'm still amazed, I didn't really think about it as a kid, when the U.S. fought 2 wars at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
That was pretty heavy.
Yes.
Equipment-wise, manpower-wise.
And it was the saving of Britain. I mean, if the United States hadn't come into the war, Britain would have been sunk.
Yeah.
You know, it would have been. In fact, while I was still in high school, you were on tenterhooks all the time. They stopped all the church bells in Britain, and church bell ringing was a sign of an invasion. And you always had an ear sort of tuned. If you heard a church bell, you had trouble on your hands, and but it didn't happen.
Never knew about that. Never heard about that in my history.
Yeah.
Well, some of the kids today, what's World War II? They don't know about it. Why is it on TV so much? It's a shame.
Yeah. I saw a lot of dogfights over Britain on the south coast there.
You saw dogfights?
Yeah, with the
Aircraft?
The aircraft. The German planes came in large numbers. I've seen 150 German planes come in one wave. And half a dozen Spitfires would get in amongst them and just create havoc. And there'd be planes falling out of the sky all the time. I saw more action like that before I went into the army than I did afterwards.
The Spitfires broke up the big time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of stories about that. Some books and movies have been written.
Yeah, they used to say that the worst thing that the German pilots could hear over their radio was "Achtung, Spitfire," and then they would,
attention,
Spitfires.
Spitfire. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, you got me talking like that now.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's European. Well, I don't know where to go from here. If you've filled my mental bucket full of stories, and then from here we're gonna go take a look at some of your pictures, and we'll talk about them.
Sure.
Are you ready for that?
Yeah. My wife and I, a day after we were married, I'm in British uniform. She's out of uniform. She was a wave, but she's not in uniform.
What's this one?
That's myself and my two brothers. I'm in Air Training Corps uniform because we had a unit of the Air Training Corps at my school, and my brother was in the Engineers, Royal Engineers at that time, and my younger brother was in the choir. He's wearing his choir.
Which one is you then, on the left
in
or?
in the middle, I think.
That's you in the middle. When you're a young boy.
No.
That one there, okay, on the end there. Got it. Why do you have an X on the window? What is
The
that?
sticky tape that we put on the windows in the belief that it would help against bomb blast. It didn't, of course, but everybody thought it would.
Is that you in the green beret hat?
Yeah.
And where was that taken at?
That was taken in Camp Ritchie, Maryland.
Camp Ritchie, Maryland.
Yeah. And that unit was composed of U.S., British, Canadian, and Australian personnel. We didn't have any Navy with us at that point, but Army and Air Force.
Well, I guess this is you.
That was my office in Tokyo, in the lower floor of the Nippon Yusen Kaisha building.
Now, did you have your own camera, or somebody else took it for you?
Someone else took that.
How'd you end up getting a copy?
I don't remember.
That's a good answer. There's two gentlemen and a lady. Is that your wife?
That was my wife. I'm one of the two gentlemen there. So it was taken on board ship going back to England from Washington, D.C.
And which one is you? Left or right?
I can't see from here.
We'll figure it out in a minute. This was a British rationing book?
Yeah.
You had one for food and you had one for
Identification and
ID and
one
clothing.
Clothing, yeah.
It said officer's release book.
Mm-hmm.
You have to carry that all the time when you got out of the Army?
No, it's just I had it with me because my wife and I were leaving for the United States and Canada as soon as possible, so I needed identification for that.
Sure. Yeah. This is a discharge document for your wife?
My wife's discharge. Yeah.
Where was this photo taken?
In Tokyo, right outside the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. I was sitting on part of the broken wall there.
Where was this photo taken of yourself, do you know?
That was taken in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
when we came back from Japan.
Where was this one taken?
That was in Washington, D.C. Computer house.
This is taken where?
That's taken in Southampton, in the south of England.
And you got your uniform on. How long were you in the Army when the picture was taken?
I got out in the summer of 1947.
Oh, this is your getting out uniform?
That was my battle dress, that was normal wear in British Army.
Okay. You just told me something about being very fortunate. What's that?
Yeah, looking back on my time in the Army, I was in many ways very fortunate because I worked with interesting people in fascinating places, and by and large was relatively safer in the Army than I'd been before I went into the Army on the south coast of England, where we were getting continuously bombed. Fortunately, my parents' home wasn't damaged, but
your parents' home wasn't damaged?
Was not damaged at all.
Okay.
But I had a very interesting experience in that an uncle of mine was on the Titanic. He was lost with the Titanic.
When you lost in it, when it went down?
And there was a memorial to him over his seat in the choir stalls in a church downtown in Southampton. That got badly bombed one night. And I got permission to go into the wreckage and see if I could find the memorial plaque, which I did. It was hanging by one screw off the wall with the backing had burned off the metal.
Now this is wreckage somebody got off the ship in the ocean?
No, of the church.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I got it off the wall and I came out and I got lost. All the buildings that I knew downtown were gone. And it's amazing how you don't realize how much you navigate by buildings.
And you're in the street and you can't tell up.
And the buildings were gone, and I couldn't figure out where I was. You know,
Never thought about that.
it's interesting. You know, you don't realize when you're in a downtown area, you know shops, you know buildings, you know offices, and that's how you navigate. And when they're gone, all of a sudden you've lost your landmarks. You know.
So what happened to your parents then? They survived the war?
Yeah.
Totally?
Yeah.
Okay. Good ending.
Yeah, my father was worked in the docks in Southampton all through the war, and was when things started to gear up for D-Day. I don't know what he did. He wouldn't say. He kept clam shut on that, and so I have no idea just what he was doing when they were gearing up for D-Day. But something like 1 million U.S. troops went through my hometown going to France, and he was in the middle of that. But
He wouldn't talk to you.
But he would never say anything about it.
Strange.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for taking time this afternoon to talk to me about this part of history. If it wasn't for people like you, we wouldn't have the whole story from the ground up. Thank you, Don.
You're very welcome. It's interesting to remember things yourself, you know, and bring it back. As I say, my older brother, he volunteered for the reserve in 1938 because he could see war coming, and he was right. Of course, war did come, but when they started to gear up for D-Day, all those men were transferred to infantry. So he was out of engineers into infantry. Women took over all the jobs that he had done: coastal defense, anti-aircraft, searchlights, barrage balloons, weaponry. The women were doing in England. Women were drafted in England through the war.
I think everybody was, if they were physically fit enough to go.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Talk to you again. Bye-bye.